Stephen Pollington has been writing about the history of early medieval Europe for more than 30 years on topics as diverse as weapons and warfare, the medical tradition, aspects of religion, kingship, writing systems, and linguistics, using literary, archaeological, and comparative sources. Many of his books have become standard works for their subjects, and he has also contributed to reference works such as the Oxford Companion to Military History. He teaches Old English language and literature with the City Literary Institute, London, and gives presentations on a wide range of related topics. That is, of course, his standard bio, but it, of course, doesn't mention the fact that really what I think Steve is most well known for is for being the author of dozens of books that have brought knowledge of Old English and early medieval England to a huge number of readers in the general public and have spread a great deal of interest about our field to the world. So I think that is Steve's primary legacy. And of course, it's a legacy that is still being formed as the publication of Woden, a historical companion, indicates. So without further ado, let's hear from Stephen Pollington now.
Right. Hi. Good day to you all. As after Len's wonderful introduction, I don't quite know where to go from here other than to share the first screen, which hopefully you're all getting now. Matres, Matronae, and Modranecht. I hope that's clear to everybody. And I'm departing on this occasion from standard practice because what I normally do is go back to the earliest sources and work forward. But on this occasion, I'm going to switch things around a bit and share something with you that formed a part of certainly of my childhood and probably the childhoods of many of you as well. And that is, if I can get this thing to work, Sleeping Beauty. Unusual place to start, I know, but it's an interesting tale in itself. The earliest references we have to it date from the 14th century. The earliest actual versions of this tale in the form that we would recognize. It's a medieval French tale called Perceforest, which is found not only in France, but versions of it in Catalonia, in Italy, and in Germany. And it's a familiar tale, isn't it? The royal couple are fortunate enough to have a baby girl, and the news of the birth comes to the attention of some itinerant females who are able to foretell the course of the child's life. It's a familiar theme. And in the course of the celebrations of the child, the first of these mysterious women blesses the child with great beauty, and then certainly in the versions that I read as a child, something happens to anger the second female. In one version, I think there's an implied slight against her. Her powers are impugned in some way, and she turns rather ugly and curses the child to an early death. And then the third female, the third of this triad of potent women, takes pity on the child and tries to reverse the curse, but is not able actually to do so. She's not up to the task, but she can kind of deflect it a little, mitigate it, and turn the threat of an early death into a sort of trance-like state, which is long-lived but not permanent. She'll sleep for 100 years in the versions that I heard as a child. And this trance is going to be initiated by an accidental but foreseen piercing. It's either with a thorn in some versions, or in the version that I heard, it's the spike on a spinning wheel that's going to do the thing. which is it, it's an unusual. I mean, I took this as just being part of the fairy tale tradition as a child, but of course, it is an unusual thing that you've got itinerant women with prophetic powers who turn up on an auspicious occasion like this. I didn't think anything of it, but it is unusual. The modern version, the La Belle au Bois dormant, the beautiful girl sleeping in the woods, certainly goes back as far as Perrault in the latter end of the 17th century. Um, and the ladies, the supernatural females, if you like, are in that tradition. They're called fées. The French fées. We can translate it by the modern English word fairy, but that really doesn't quite capture the nature of these beings. Fairy is unfortunately too far contaminated, I think the word is, with, well, both with Victorian ideas of little creatures flitting between the flowers and also the Disney versions that have come to dominate. Fairy, or rather fée, the French word, is the French cognate of the Latin word fatum. Fatum means what is decreed or ordained. It's obviously the modern English word fate is also based on that same idea. So the idea that these magical or supernatural ladies, their purpose in turning up is somehow connected with shaping or recording or interpreting the course of the child's life. It's about really prophecy and predetermination. And in the Grimm's German version of the tale, they're not fey in the French sense. They're wise women. They're peddlers and beggars in a way, who are not people who necessarily have supernatural powers. But there's a disjuncture here. There's a misunderstanding or adaptation of the tradition. So, in the story that I heard, the death curse was commuted to dormancy, hence the name Sleeping Beauty. The girl goes into basically stasis, but with a proviso that she will one day be awoken from her magical sleep by the kiss of a worthy suitor, which is an interesting development. Because there's a parallel to this in the medieval story of Brynhild in the Völsunga saga and in Skaldskaparmal, where Brynhild is a disobedient Valkyrie. She's punished by Odin. She's left in a dormant state in a high tower, surrounded by, I think in one version, it's a ring of fire. In another version, I have a feeling there's a sort of impenetrable hedge laid about the base of the tower, but it's difficult of access, and actually successful entry can only be performed by a worthy suitor who, penetrating, wins her hand. Which is it's an interesting tale. It has resonances elsewhere in folklore, of course. Back in the days when nature myth was the way to interpret all myths and legends, the idea grew up that this is a tale about it's a myth about the sleep of the earth in winter, awoken by the resurgent sun of springtime, which is a rather lovely image. The other way of interpreting it is to say that it's a coming of age tale, and it's the pubescent female awoken to full womanhood by sexual contact with a male. Yeah, either of those is a plausible interpretation if your starting point is explaining away rather than explaining the story. The idea that the future life course can be can be headed off the fate that has been decreed can in some way be interfered with, amended, is quite interesting in itself too, in as much as we have the Norse story of the fate of Baldur. Baldur is disturbed by dreams which seem to foretell his death. And his mother learns of this. His mother is the goddess Frigg, and she takes steps to avoid the harm that has been foreseen for Baldur by securing oaths from all the possible sources of injury. And we know that she misses one thing, and disaster is not forestalled, but actually encouraged. She brings about the means of the fateful piercing with the spike. So there are ideas there that are run deep into the mythology of Northern Europe. The Brunhild legend itself has some sort of historical basis anyway. There was a princess of the Visigoths called Brunhilda of Austrasia, and she was wedded to the Merovingian king Sigebert I, and then he was murdered in 575 AD. So it goes back a good long while. We're looking at 1500 years or so of Brunhild's coming to a sticky end, but not in quite the way that the Wolfsinger saga tells us. So the interesting aspect here, really, one of the interesting things, is this idea of a group of itinerant females who rely on the goodwill and hospitality of farmers for their subsistence. Not a normal state of affairs, but you can imagine that there would be itinerant workmen and peddlers and traders of various kinds in early medieval Europe who might be able to scratch a living by going from farm to farm and peddling their wares and their services, but also using a little bit of psychology to make the farmers somewhat suspicious of them and to treat them with caution and to be sure that they remained on good terms with them. In the tale, the females know where and when a gathering will take place, and they arrive expecting a welcome, which is, again, not always the case where traveling salesmen of various kinds are concerned. And the farmers believe that they have the power not only of prophecy, foretelling the future, but also of blessing, of affecting the future. And of course, the farmers wish to access this on behalf of the newborn child. If they have the power to affect the outcome in a beneficial way, they equally have the power to curse the child. So they have to be treated with caution. The fae of medieval French tales resemble in some respects the female group who appear in Old Norse tales as the Nornir, but the word is used in two complementary but rather different senses. In myth, the Nornir are the three otherworldly females who shape the lives of men and gods. They stand outside time and space. They have the power of creation and destruction. They can affect the individual lives of men. And there are three of these powers. In Falvnismal, there are three kinds of non-specified. Sumar eru Auskungar, Sumar Alfkungar, Sumar Dötter Dvalins, the daughters of Dvalin. So they're regarded as dwarves, ineffectively. And groups of three are a common theme throughout discussion of these things. We have Urður, Skuld, and Verdandi as the names of these females in Scandinavian tradition. And the temptation has been throughout the scholarship on this to regard them as essentially the three tenses: past, present, and future. Urður being the what is done, skuld what is to come, and verðandi, which means becoming, somehow connected with the present. And that's very, very tempting as an explanation, and it sort of ties up in a way with the ideas of the Greek parkai. Um, but the Germanic verbal system, the tense system of Germanic verbs, isn't split into three like this. It's actually split into two. We have the past, which is fixed and unchanging, and we have the present, which is fluid and coming into being the whole time. And the future doesn't really exist as a separate aspect, it both in language and in the sort of worldview. The Nornir in Völuspá and other texts of Norse mythology seem to be connected very, very strongly with the world tree, which sustains the whole of creation. So they're immensely important. And the gods themselves are subject to their will. So they probably represent an older stratum of being there. The other use of the word Norn occurs maybe towards the end of the period when Christianity has already made inroads into northern society, and we have the story of a chap called the Nornagestur, guest of the Norns, who was an Icelander who went off and had all kinds of adventures, and at a certain point visited the court of King Olafur Tryggvason and related tales of his adventures. And the king asked why he had such an unusual name, and Nornagestur explained that I was raised in a place called Graninger by my father. And at that time, seeresses travelled about the land who were called Nornir, and they foretold men's lives. And essentially, these females turned up at the possibly the name giving ceremony. The story is not explicit on that point, but it seems likely that there's a ceremony underway of adoption, of accepting the newborn child into the kindred. And at that point, all bets are off. Anything can happen, and that's when you need the intercession of benevolent powers to make sure things turn out well for them. But on this occasion, there was a younger of the three Nornir, and she was a bit disgruntled because she didn't feel that people were paying her enough respect anyway. And then when a group of rough men pushed her off her seat so that she fell to the earth, she lost it big time. I think the way of explaining these things, she became mightily enraged over it, and she shaped it for him, the child, that he shall not live longer than the burning of the candle which is lit above him. So the other seeresses were unable to do anything about this other than quickly quench the candle and pass it to the mother for safekeeping, who then gave it to the man himself when he became grown. But the Nornir were given good gifts when they left, and the two older Norns held the younger Norn in check. So that in itself seems there's a structure there. There's no explicit reference to the relationship between these three females, but reading that, the idea of the three sisters and all the overtones that has in English literature, it just seems unavoidable that there's something going on there. Of course, the point about young Northern Guest's tale is not actually that there were magical beggar women roaming the Icelandic countryside at the end of the first millennium. The point is that the idea was considered plausible in the context of the society at that time. Um, the it's a common fairy tale motif, of course. It doesn't relate to everyday existence, but within the context of tale telling, it's entirely it's not unexpected. It's within the range of things that one would expect to happen. And from what we learn of the Spey wives, the Nornir, it isn't clear whether they come to learn the fate of the child. They turn up in order to receive wisdom from outside and apply it to the child, inform the parents, which is what happens in Baldur's Draumr when Frigg learns of the future doom of her son, or whether they actually come to create the shape of the child's life, to influence it and to determine how things are going to turn out. And that's an interesting point because it rather depends whether these people are actively creating or whether they're passively receiving the broadcast from the universe and able to interpret it and hand the knowledge on. The suggestion is that they actually are able to create the shape of the child's life and to influence it in various ways. So, what's all that got to do with Modranecht then? Bede of blessed memory wrote in his tract on the months of the English, De Mensibus Anglorum, back in the 8th century, a tradition or observed in his day about something called Modranecht. He says, nevertheless, they began the year from the 8th day of the calendar of January, on which we now celebrate the Lord's birth. And that same night, now holy for us, they then called in the language of the people Modranecht, that is, Night of the Mothers, because of the night-long ceremonies which they performed, as we understand it. Night-long ceremonies sounds great, but these perwigiles, he doesn't tell us what they are, but nor would we expect him to. It's quite unusual for Bede to say anything about the arrangements that existed prior to the advent of Christianity, other than to condemn it and to regard most of the people who did it as either ignorant or downright evil, particularly if they were Mercians. There we are. That's Bede for you. But the idea is that in his day, there are celebrations of the mothers in rites that last a long time, that last all night, which is interesting because there are a number of traditions concerning mothers' nights or rather concerning matronae, concerning mothers and motherly figures in general. They're either matronae, which means motherly ones, or ladies due the same respect as one would give to one's mother, or they are actually matres, they're just mothers. And there seem to be a class of divine supernatural beings that appear in Roman period religious and devotional sculpture from at least the late 1st century AD through to the 4th, possibly longer. I mean, we don't know. The sculptures that were made of them may well have remained objects of veneration for centuries to come afterwards. And maybe they were reinterpreted, if you like, as forms of a nativity scene, something along those lines. But they're always groups of 3, and they're usually mature females. They're not children, they're not youngsters, they're not teenagers. And they're usually shown seated, often with the hair uncovered or with some form of ornate head covering. So they must have been important because there are enough of them, and we do do find them regularly in certain areas. The downside is there are no contemporary descriptions of them. As far as I've been able to determine, anyway, I haven't found any literary references to them or suggestions as to what kinds of thing they were believed to be able to control, what rights were appropriate for them. All we have to go on really is the names and the iconography, but that can be quite helpful. Sometimes they have a dedicatory inscription in Latin naming the group, which is very helpful. And the source language in which these names are coined, sometimes it's demonstrably Celtic, sometimes it's almost certainly Germanic. Often enough, it's sort of indeterminate because some of these figures are named, for example, from a place or from a particular person or from a river. And those names are of sort of unknowable antiquity in many cases. The areas where they're most common are parts of Britannia, mainly the Hadrian's Wall, actually, in Britain, but also there's a whole series of them in Gloucestershire and the Welsh border. Parts of Germania Inferior, which is sort of the Western Rhineland in modern terms, and then Gallia, Gaul or France, and Belgica, the Channel coast. And these are really all militarized or liminal zones. They're administered by the Roman Empire. They pay their taxes to the Roman authorities, but they're under military rule in many ways. The places from which the troops who administer them are drawn are usually either the Rhineland or Gaul, sometimes the Netherlands, demonstrably, like the Tencteri and the Ubi and so on. But yeah, groups of three ladies, and the period when the sculptures are particularly being made seems to be the late 1st century through to the 3rd, but they do continue in use beyond that. And then really basically the records give out, so we really don't know quite when they fell into disuse. They're usually presented in groups of three, and groups of three are, from an iconographic point of view, that a group of three figures is very pleasing and allows a certain freedom to the artist to show differences in costume and aspect, so on. So that's a good thing. They often have attributes which are usually confined to either a basket with something small and round on it. One can assume that they're fruit like apples, or maybe they're small loaves. Impossible to say, because I assume these things were originally painted and coloured and much more vibrant than they appear today, but the pigment just doesn't survive. Sometimes they have a cornucopia, which is a horn with various fruits and good things sort of spilling out of the top. Often enough a frond or branch, and also a dog or another small animal to their side. Sometimes it's clearly a dog, sometimes maybe it's a hare, something along those lines. There's reasonable inference that there was incense was burnt at these altars, and the altars themselves may have stood in a small stand of trees. That's from archaeology, it's not always possible to determine these things with absolute certainty, but it does seem a reasonable inference from some of the sites that they stood in a what in Old English would have been called a hyrst, a shore, a small stand of trees in an otherwise open landscape. We don't know when their rites and celebrations took place. There's no indication in the iconography. You could apply what Bede says and say it was a midwinter thing, but I suspect they were actually turned to regularly by the people who erected them, that maybe there was a particular ceremony associated with them at midwinter, but it seems an awful lot of trouble to go to create these things in stone if they're only going to be used once a year. Far more likely that they were objects which people could make offerings to whenever the need arose. There are over 100 individual names, including variants, and they seem to occur in clusters, little concentrations. So, which sort of implies that they were important to specific groups rather than generally to the population. And if that's the case, then the likelihood is that these are places where soldiers are billeted, or there's a military presence of some kind. And so there's a need to have a shrine, a cult site in that area. The names of the persons who erect these monuments, these stele, are often Germanic or can be interpreted as Germanic. Also often they're Celtic in the general sense, more likely Gaulish in the narrow sense, and they're personal names of specific types. And the reason for that is given for setting up these monuments, where any reason is given, is gratitude for a wish granted. There are formulae for expressing that in Latin tradition. Can't help thinking they also probably used the maternal aspects of their figures to maintain a sort of symbolic contact with their homeland, in something like the way that in Roman tradition they have the soldiers have lares, which are little figures representing the home which they are able to with which they can communicate with the home. Actual meanings of the names not always can be determined with any confidence, to be honest, and they do occur in clusters, which suggests that the names had some important meaning. They weren't casually bestowed. They were names which had a resonance for the people who erect these monuments. Austrahenie is a name that we're going to hear more about from shortly, from Richard, which possibly related to the word dawn, and that in itself may be related to the figure that Bede calls Eostre. There's a group of dedications to the Alfanie in the Bonn area, which probably related to a word for abundance. Some of the names are nationality based. They're ethnonyms. Matris Suebis, the mothers of the Suebi. Matris Frisiawis, based on the Frisians. The Chamech, can't even say it, Chamavechai, the Chamavi, another famous Germanic tribe of the 1st century AD. And yeah, and individual places seem to have given rise to maternal figures in their turn. A recurrent theme is generosity, giving. Some of the names are Gabiai, those who give, and variants such as Fria Gabiai, those who give with love, or Alagafiai, those who give all. And that's where we come up against the fact that these names have been mediated through the requirements of Latin orthography and Latin grammar. It's difficult to know whether the origin of Alagabiae is the Celtic Ologabiae or the Germanic equivalent Alagaviae. They both mean the same thing, giving all, and they presumably have a an origin in sort of late Western Indo-European, back in the late Bronze Age, maybe. So the distinction between Celtic and Germanic is a distinction that we might make. It's not necessarily one that would have been made at the time. Matres Alfania, I mentioned previously. The meaning of that name, again, like all of these things, it's not 100% certain, but the suggestion is it's based on a noun that appears in Gothic as Ufio. Ufio is abundance, wealth, plenty, superfluity, if you like. So, which is an appropriate name for persons that you're likely to approach with a view to getting them to share some of the abundance that they have. In the case of the Matres Alfaniae, they have, in the illustration there, the carving that we have from Bonn, the central figure is shown as a matriarch, if you like, but she's flanked by two ladies with really rather peculiar dome-like or spherical. I don't know if they're hairstyles or headdresses, probably headdresses, I would imagine, and that this is somehow a symbol of their authority. That hairstyle or headdress is, I think, associated elsewhere with a tribe called the Ubyi. So the carving ties into the wider cultural history of the people. Yeah, prepubescent females and children weren't obliged to cover their hair, but for married women it was customary. So it's saying something about the status of the two flanking ladies, and the central one, oddly enough, is shown with uncovered hair. Is that because she's of lesser importance? Seems unlikely. It's her importance is shown in a different way, maybe by some detail of her dress that we can't recapture now because the coloration and so on is gone. There are single goddesses, and that sort of poses the question: are all these supernatural females Matronae? I don't think they are. I don't think we can assume that they are, at least. There are 28 surviving altars or stelae in Frisia and a little further south, all dedicated to Dea Neheleniae, the goddess Nehelenia. But she's not shown as a matrona. She's not a mater. She doesn't. The inscription doesn't suggest that she's a mater. Some of the attributes that she has, like the small dog and the basket of fruit, are associated with Matrona, but she's also got the prow of a ship. She's got one foot on the prow of a ship. She's far more associated with seafaring, and we know from other evidence that she seems to have been turned to by seamen making a crossing either over to Britannia, or maybe they came to the altar having completed the journey successfully and made a little sacrifice to her. So she's a protective female, but she's not a matrona in the narrow sense. Likewise, there's a Frisian inscription to somebody called Baduhen, whose the first part of her name is Badwa, which is battle. Clearly, that's not a maternal activity. This is something a little more robust. Possibly, we can infer here evidence for a different group of supernatural females who appear in Old English as the Idesa, in Old High German Idisi, and in Old Norse as Disir. And they're, again, numinous in as much as they have a human referent. There are humans who are called Idesa, but they have a kind of supernatural resonance to them. So they could be priestesses, maybe, or I'm tempted to think of figures like what Tacitus has to say about Veleda, the prophetess who was kept in a tower and who interpreted people's questions through the interaction with kinsmen who took messages to her and gave her answers. So she is clearly a human being, but she has access to other world knowledge and so on. And I think that's sort of where we're going with the Ides figure. There's another figure in Old English literature, but of a rather different nature. This is Grendlis Mordor, the sort of the cave dwelling troll in Beowulf, who is an Ides Aglachwif, a monster woman, a fierce, vengeful, and monstrous female figure, much more like the supernatural females, the Valkyrier, who weave the guts of slain men on a loom weighted with severed heads. Again, not terribly maternal. A different order of being and a different kind of supernatural female, one would hope. But in Old English, we do have an invocation to a benevolent female provider in the Akkerbod charm, where you have Erche, 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 Erthan Mordor, Erche, mother of earth, or mother in the earth, potentially. But this is not centered on maternal provision. This is really about sexual love, to put it bluntly, because we have the explicit statement, Beotho growende on Goddess Phasme, may you start to grow in the embrace of God, be filled with food for the use of mankind. So it's productivity, it's fertility, but it's not the Nutrix kind of figure, the mother providing milk for the children, a much more earthy and primal kind of business here. And I've sort of touched on this previously, and you will I'm sure, have all picked up on the idea of three sisters in Macbeth, the wayward sisters, or weird sisters as they're called. Are they Matronae? Not in any reading that I can put onto them, because they're duplicitous. The thing that they do is to lead Macbeth to an early death, and they give him misleading information, fake news, not outright lies, but they encourage him to a misunderstanding and misinterpretation of the information that they provide. It's got Odin written all over it. This is just the kind of thing that that Odin does for the people who follow him. They're encouraged down a certain path, and then when they're no longer of use, or when he has other plans, that's it. Good night. And in that respect, those three sisters do have a sort of resemblance to the Parakai, who have power over past, present, and future. Although that in itself is a simplification, because really the Parakai, the Greek figures, what you have, one who spins the thread, one who measures the thread, and one who cuts the thread. So it's not really past, present, future. It's creation, judgment, and completion, or youth, maturity, and death, if you want to think of it in those terms. So not Matronae by any stretch of the imagination. So to sum up then, Matronae usually appear in groups of three. A single figure would not fit the iconographic convention of Matronae. They're connected to motherhood and foreseeing the shape of an infant's life. They can provide assistance and sustenance, but you have to ask it of them, and you have to offer them something in return. Otherwise, the do des principle will be violated. It's no longer reciprocity, but something a little more selfish. They sort of overlap in their protective function with some solitary female figures like Nehelenia, or in Norse, later Norse tradition, you have a figure called Thorgerðr Hulgabröðr, who who sort of looks after the interests of one particular adopted hero. But again, we're getting back into the Odin cycle of tales and away from what the Matroni are really all about, which doesn't fit really with that duality of the Aesir and the Vanir, the warrior magicians and leaders versus the producers and providers of fertility and so on. That is probably an early medieval Scandinavian division of labor amongst the other world powers. I think that the Matroni are older than this and more powerful and more earthy and more basic and visceral than this. But they're worthy of study, and they do require a proper book length discussion. And who knows, one day. So with that, I'll hand over to Richard. I've almost run over, 1 minute out. Hand over to Richard at this point.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, for the brilliant presentation.